Camp Florence, Arizona. Summer 1945. The Brownies sat on a metal tray, dark and glistening, sugar crystals catching the overhead light like tiny diamonds. Greta Hoffmann stared at it for a full 30 seconds before touching it, convinced it was a test, that someone would take it away. That punishment would follow pleasure. In Germany, she'd eaten sawdust bread and turnip soup for 2 years. Now, here in the American desert, an enemy soldier offered her chocolate. The transport arrived at Camp Florence on a Tuesday afternoon when the temperature reached 112 degrees. 43 German women stepped off the trucks into heat that felt solid. Visible, a wall of shimmer and dust that distorted everything beyond 20 feet. They wore the same gray uniforms they'd been captured in Luftwaffe auxiliaries, communications officers, medical personnel, administrative staff. Women who'd worked behind the lines, never fired a weapon, never saw combat directly, but wore the uniform of a nation now defeated and occupied. The camp sprawled across the Arizona desert like a temporary city. Rows of wooden barracks painted white to reflect the brutal sun. Guard towers at the corners, but the men inside looked bored, reading magazines, smoking cigarettes. Wire fences that seemed almost decorative given the emptiness beyond them, miles of desert in every direction. Saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, mountains purple in the distance. Where would anyone run to? Greta was 24. She'd worked in a communications center in France, translating intercepted Allied messages until the collapse in 44. Captured during the retreat, held in a French facility for 8 months before transfer to America. The propaganda had been specific about what happened to German prisoners in America. Forced labor, starvation, cruelty designed to break spirits. She'd prepared herself for that, tried to make peace with it. But the sergeant processing them, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a sun-weathered face, spoke in patient, slow English and didn't raise his voice once. "You'll be assigned barracks," he explained. "Work details start tomorrow. Kitchen duty, laundry, grounds maintenance. Follow the rules. You'll be treated fair." Simple as that. Greta understood maybe 1 word in 3, but his tone communicated something the words didn't. Not hostility, not cruelty, just bureaucratic efficiency with an edge of something that might have been kindness. The barracks were cleaner than anywhere Greta had lived in 2 years. Wooden bunks with actual mattresses, thin but present. Sheets and blankets stacked at the end of each bed. Windows with screens to keep out insects. A small stove in the corner for winter, though winter felt impossible in this heat. The 43 women moved through the space in stunned silence, touching things carefully, waiting for someone to say it was a mistake. Marguerite Waldstein, 31, former medical officer, claimed a bunk near the door and sat down slowly, testing the mattress like it might collapse. "The thing is," she said in German, "we're not valuable. We're not officers. We're just auxiliaries. Why would they waste resources on us?" "Maybe they have resources to waste," another woman said. Ilse Fischer, 19, communications clerk. "America is rich. Everyone knows that. Rich enough to give mattresses to prisoners?" Marguerite shook her head. "Something is wrong here. This doesn't make sense." But nothing made sense anymore, Greta thought. The war was over. Germany had collapsed. The leadership had met their end. The great ideological project had turned to ash and rubble and millions of dead. And here they were, German women in an American prison camp, sleeping on mattresses in the desert. That first night, Greta lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, she could see stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, scattered across the sky like someone had spilled light from a bucket. No blackout regulations here. No fear of bombers. Just stars and silence, and the distant sound of American guards talking in low voices about baseball and girls back home and whether the food in the mess would be any good tomorrow. For the first time in years, Greta felt something that wasn't fear, or hunger, or exhaustion. She wasn't sure what to call it. Not hope, exactly, but maybe its distant cousin. Maybe the faint possibility that survival was actually possible. The mess hall was where everything changed. They were marched there the next morning for breakfast, 43 German women in gray uniforms, escorted by 2 guards who walked alongside rather than behind, who didn't carry rifles, who made jokes with each other in English that the women couldn't understand, but that sounded friendly rather than threatening. The mess hall was enormous. Long tables with benches. A serving line where American soldiers and civilian staff moved with practiced efficiency. The smell hit Greta before she saw the food coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz grain substitute she'd drunk in Germany. Bacon, bread toasting, something sweet she couldn't identify. The line moved forward. Each woman received a metal tray. The servers, Americans, not prisoners, loaded the trays with portions that made Greta's breath catch. 2 eggs, fried in butter that pooled yellow and glistening. 4 strips of bacon, crispy at the edges. 2 slices of toast with real butter and jam. A glass of milk. And a cup of coffee that steamed in the morning heat. Greta stared at her tray. This was more food than she'd seen in a single meal in 2 years. More protein than she'd eaten in a month during the final winter of the war when everything collapsed, and supply lines disappeared, and people ate whatever could be found. She looked at the server, a young man, maybe 20, with sandy hair and a friendly face. He smiled at her. "Plenty more where that came from," he said. "You folks need to put some meat on those bones." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the smile, the generous portions, the casual abundance that suggested this wasn't special treatment, but standard procedure. She sat at a table with Marguerite and Ilse and 3 other women from their barracks. For a long moment, none of them touched the food. They just stared at it, convinced it would vanish, that someone would realize the mistake and take it away. Then Ilse picked up her fork and took a bite of egg. Her eyes went wide. "Oh God," she whispered in German. "It's real." The dam broke. 43 women ate breakfast with the focused intensity of people who'd forgotten what it meant to be full. The eggs tasted like luxury. The bacon was crispy and salty and perfect. The toast was soft inside and crunchy outside. The coffee was strong and bitter and wonderful. Greta ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize every bite, because surely this couldn't continue. Surely tomorrow would bring the sawdust bread and turnip soup she prepared herself for. This was an anomaly, a propaganda move, something to photograph and show the Red Cross. But deep down, a small voice whispered something else. What if this was normal? What if Americans really did eat like this every day? What if the propaganda about American poverty and desperation had been exactly as false as the propaganda about everything else? After breakfast, they were assigned work details. Greta and 15 other women were sent to the camp kitchen. Not to cook, the cooking was done by American staff, but to clean, to wash dishes, to help with food preparation tasks that didn't require English communication. The kitchen supervisor was a woman named Dorothy, 40-something with graying hair, and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Greta of her mother. Dorothy showed them the industrial sinks, the dish racks, the proper way to scrub the large cooking pots. She spoke slowly, used hand gestures, demonstrated everything twice. When one of the German women, a girl named Anna, who couldn't have been more than 17 accidentally, dropped a plate, and it shattered across the floor. She froze, waiting for the punishment. Dorothy just sighed, handed her a broom, and showed her where the dustpan was kept. "Accidents happen," she said in slow English. "Just be more careful." Anna swept up the pieces with trembling hands, shocked that nothing worse had followed. The work was hot and repetitive, but not difficult. Washing endless dishes from the camp's meals, scrubbing pots, cleaning prep surfaces. Around 11, Dorothy brought out a pitcher of cold water and glasses. You girls need to stay hydrated in this heat, she said. Drink up. Greta drank 3 glasses. The water was cold, clean, better than anything she'd had in years. In Germany, toward the end, water supplies had been contaminated, and you had to boil everything or risk dysentery. Here, clean water flowed from taps like magic. At noon, Dorothy announced lunch break. The German women looked at each other, confused. Lunch? They'd had breakfast 3 hours ago. Surely there wasn't more food already. But there was. The kitchen staff served them sandwiches, thick slices of bread, with ham and cheese and lettuce and tomato, a side of chips, an apple, and a glass of something brown and unfamiliar. Chocolate milk, Dorothy said, seeing their confusion. You folks never had chocolate milk? None of them had. Chocolate was a luxury in Germany even before the war. During the war, it disappeared entirely unless you were part of the leadership's inner circle. Chocolate milk, the casual combination of 2 expensive ingredients, seemed almost obscene in its abundance. Greta tasted it cautiously. Sweet, rich, cold, unlike anything she'd experienced. She drank it slowly, reverently, trying to understand how a nation at war could give chocolate milk to enemy prisoners. That afternoon, Dorothy pulled out a tray of brownies. Made these this morning, she said. Figured you girls might like a treat. The brownies were still warm, dense, and fudgy, the chocolate smell filling the kitchen. Dorothy cut them into squares and handed them out. Greta held hers like it was made of gold, took a small bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Chocolate, sugar, butter, vanilla, rich and sweet and perfect. She wanted to cry, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming experience of something good after years of deprivation. The brownie wasn't just food. It was a message. It said, you are not garbage. You are not less than human. You deserve to eat something sweet. Later, in her diary, a small notebook Dorothy had given her when Greta asked if she could write, she tried to capture the moment. Today, they gave us brownies. I know how that sounds, like I'm a child excited about candy. But you have to understand, for 2 years, I ate food that barely qualified as food. Bread mixed with sawdust. Soup made from grass and potato peels. I watched friends sicken and waste away from malnutrition. I accepted that I might do the same. And today, an American woman I barely know gave me a brownie she made herself. She smiled when she handed it to me, like it was nothing. Like feeding German prisoners chocolate desserts was completely normal. I don't understand this country. I don't understand their abundance or their casual generosity, or why they would waste chocolate on people they're supposed to hate. But I know one thing: everything we were told was a lie. The pattern continued for weeks. Every morning, breakfast that would have fed a German family for days. Eggs, meat, bread, fruit, coffee. Every lunch, sandwiches or hot meals with portions that seemed designed to put weight back on malnourished bodies. Every dinner, proteins and vegetables and starches, served in combinations that spoke of a food supply chain so abundant it never occurred to anyone to ration carefully. And the treats. Oh, the treats. Dorothy baked constantly. Cookies, cakes, pies, brownies. She said it helped keep morale up, that soldiers and prisoners alike appreciated something sweet. But Greta suspected there was more to it. Dorothy had lost a son in the Pacific. They learned eventually. He died at Guadalcanal in '42. Yet here she was, baking brownies for German prisoners, treating them with patience and even kindness. Why? Greta finally asked one day, her English improving enough for simple questions. Why you help us? We are enemy. Dorothy considered the question while rolling out pie dough. Because you're also human beings who need help, she said finally. And because my boy would have wanted me to. He believed in treating people decent, even in war, especially in war. The food wasn't the only shock. There were other small kindnesses that accumulated like drops of water wearing down stone. The camp library, where prisoners could check out books and magazines. The recreation area with volleyball nets and equipment for games. The chaplain who offered religious services in German for anyone interested. The base doctor who treated a woman as infected tooth with the same care he'd give an American patient. The guards who learned to say Guten Morgen and seemed pleased when the women taught them more German phrases. None of it made sense within the framework Greta had been given to understand the world. America was supposed to be the enemy, cruel, exploitative, interested only in profit and domination. Yet everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of something else. Not perfection, not some utopia, but a fundamental assumption that even prisoners deserved basic dignity. Marguerite remained skeptical. They're preparing us for something, she'd say. Propaganda trials or forced labor. This is just the setup. But as weeks turned to months, as summer heat gave way to autumn's slightly cooler temperatures, as the food kept coming and the small kindnesses kept accumulating, even Marguerite's skepticism began to crack. In September, Dorothy organized a birthday celebration for one of the German women. Helga Fischer was turning 21. In Germany, her family would have been lucky to have enough food for a normal meal, much less a celebration. Here, Dorothy baked a real cake, with frosting and candles, and gathered the kitchen workers to sing. They sang in English, "Happy birthday to you." The German women didn't know the words, but hummed along. Helga cried. Not sad tears, overwhelmed tears. The tears of someone who'd expected nothing and received something she didn't even know she needed. Dorothy cut the cake and served it with ice cream. Ice cream, in a prison camp, for the birthday of an enemy combatant. Greta ate her slice slowly, and something inside her that had been carefully locked away for years began to unlock. She'd built walls around herself during the war, walls that let her function, that kept her moving through deprivation and fear, and the slow realization that everything she believed was false. But walls also kept out light, kept out the possibility of trust, kept out the dangerous idea that maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel. The ice cream melted on her tongue, vanilla, sweet, cold, and the walls cracked a little more. By October, some of the women had begun to understand English well enough to follow conversations. Greta listened to the guards and kitchen staff talk about their lives back home, about missing their families, about hoping the war with Japan would end soon so they could go back to normal, about baseball scores and movie stars and what they planned to do after discharge. Normal things, human things, the same things German soldiers probably talked about. One guard, a corporal named Miller, showed them photographs of his farm in Iowa, cornfields stretching to the horizon, a red barn, cattle grazing, his wife and 2 children standing in front of the house, smiling. "This is what I'm fighting for," he said. "Just want to get back to my family and my farm. That's all any of us want." Greta looked at the photographs and thought about German soldiers saying the same things. Everyone believed they were fighting for home, for family, for protection against threats both real and imagined. Everyone believed the propaganda they were fed. Everyone suffered. Everyone wanted it to end. The difference was, America apparently had enough resources to feed its prisoners chocolate milk and brownies while fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans. That surplus, that casual abundance, said something about industrial capacity and agricultural productivity that all the propaganda in the world couldn't obscure. In November, the war ended completely. Japan surrendered after the devastating weapons were used. The radios in the mess hall announced it, and the entire camp erupted in celebration. Americans cheering, crying, hugging each other. The war was over. Finally, completely over. No more dying. No more destruction. Time to go home. The German women watched the celebration in silence. They were happy that dying had stopped. But going home meant going back to a Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it. A defeated nation, occupied, Cities destroyed, economy shattered, future uncertain. Going home meant confronting what had been done in their name, the crimes committed by the regime they'd served, even if they'd never pulled the trigger. That evening, Dorothy found Greta sitting outside the barracks, staring at the desert sunset. The sky was on fire oranges and purples and reds that seemed to stretch forever. "You okay?" Dorothy asked. Greta nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know what waits for me in Germany. My family, if they're alive. My city, if anything is left. How do you go home to something that isn't home anymore?" Dorothy sat down beside her. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know you're strong enough to figure it out. You survived the war. You survived being captured, transported, imprisoned. You'll survive going home, too. How do you know? Because you're still here, still fighting, still trying to understand this confusing world. That takes strength." They sat in silence for a while. Then Greta said, "Thank you. For the brownies. For everything. You didn't have to be kind to us." Dorothy smiled. "Sure I did. Being kind is always a choice. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The repatriation process began in January 1946. Paperwork, interviews, security clearances. The German women were processed in groups, cleared for return based on their service records and the determination that they posed no security threat. Most were just young women who'd been conscripted into support roles, who'd never made policy decisions or committed acts that would require trials. Greta's clearance came through in February. She'd be on a transport ship in March, bound for Bremen. From there, she'd try to find her family, try to rebuild something from the ruins. The night before departure, Dorothy threw a small farewell party in the kitchen. Nothing fancy, just cookies and coffee and a chance to say goodbye. She gave each woman a small care package. Chocolate bars, cookies wrapped in wax paper, a few cans of food to help with the journey home. "You take care of yourselves," Dorothy said. "And remember, the world isn't as simple as propaganda makes it seem. People are just people, everywhere. Try to remember that." Greta hugged her in impulse, spontaneous, and breaking all the formal distance between prisoner and guard. Dorothy hugged her back. "I'll never forget the brownies," Greta said. "That sounds silly, but I won't. They taught me something important." "What's that?" "That kindness is possible, even between enemies. Even in the middle of hatred and war. Someone can still choose to bake brownies for people they're supposed to hate. And that choice matters more than all the propaganda in the world." The ship journey back to Germany took 3 weeks. This time, the conditions were decent, not luxury, but adequate food, clean berths, medical care if needed. Greta spent most of the voyage on deck when weather permitted, watching the Atlantic pass beneath them, thinking about everything she'd seen and learned. In her diary, she wrote, "I'm going home to a Germany I don't recognize, to rebuild a life from fragments. I'm frightened, I'm uncertain, but I'm also different than I was when I left. The Americans gave me something more valuable than food, though the food was miraculous. They gave me evidence that humanity persists even when everything else fails. I watched them feed us when they could have let us starve. I watched them treat our injuries when they could have let us suffer. I watched Dorothy bake brownies for German prisoners after losing her son to war. These aren't political acts. These are human acts. Choices made by individuals to be better than circumstances demanded. I don't know what I'll find in Germany, but I know what I'll carry with me. The memory of chocolate milk on a hot afternoon, a brownie still warm from the oven, of an American woman who chose kindness over hatred. That memory will matter when things get hard. It will remind me that better is always possible." Greta arrived in Bremen in early April. The city was ruins. She'd heard about the destruction, but seeing it was different. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. People living in basements and makeshift shelters. Food scarce again, rationed carefully by occupation authorities. The abundance of Arizona felt like a dream. She found her mother alive in a refugee camp outside the city. Her father had died in an air raid. Her brother was missing, probably dead on the Eastern Front. But her mother and younger sister had survived, and that was more than many families could say. Greta got work with the occupation authorities, translating documents, helping facilitate communication between German civilians and Allied administrators. She used her improved English constantly. She watched the reconstruction effort, the Marshall Plan beginning to pump resources into rebuilding Europe, the slow transformation of enemies into allies. Years later, when her own children asked about the war, she told them stories. Not about battles or grand strategy, but about small moments of humanity. About a woman named Dorothy who'd lost a son, but still baked brownies for enemy prisoners. About chocolate milk in the desert. About the day she realized that propaganda had lied about everything, that people were more complicated and more capable of goodness than ideology allowed. Your grandmother learned something important during the war, she'd tell them. She learned that kindness is a choice, and that choosing kindness, especially when it's hard, especially toward enemies, is how you rebuild a broken world. One brownie at a time, if necessary. Dorothy continued working at Camp Florence until it closed in 1946. She'd spent 3 years feeding soldiers and prisoners, baking thousands of cookies and cakes and brownies, offering small kindnesses that probably seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of war and peace. But Dorothy understood something that grand strategists sometimes missed, that individual human connections mattered, that treating people with dignity had ripple effects that spread further than anyone could measure. After the camp closed, she returned to her home in Phoenix, continued baking for church socials and community events, lived quietly, never made a big deal about her war service, died peacefully in 1967 at 73. But the women who'd worked in her kitchen remembered her, sent Christmas cards for years. A few even visited, traveling from Germany to Arizona to say thank you in person, to introduce their children and grandchildren to the woman who'd shown them that enemies could become human beings again over something as simple as a brownie. The historians would note it decades later when scholars studied POW experiences. Over 370,000 German POWs passed through American camps during World War II. The vast majority reported treatment that exceeded Geneva Convention standards. Adequate food, decent housing, medical care, opportunities for recreation and education. Some, like the women at Camp Florence, encountered something beyond adequate. They encountered genuine human kindness from people who had every reason to harbor hatred. These weren't the dramatic stories of war. No battles, no heroics, no grand moments. Just an American woman baking brownies for German prisoners. Just chocolate milk on a hot afternoon. Just the daily choice to treat people as people regardless of the uniform they wore or the nation they represented. But these small moments mattered. They mattered to the individual lives they touched. They mattered in the process of reconciliation that turned enemies into allies. They mattered as proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual human beings could choose compassion over cruelty. They mattered because they were true. Camp Florence, Arizona. Summer 1945. The brownie sits on a metal tray, dark and glistening. Greta Hoffmann stares at it, convinced it's a test. But it isn't. It's just a brownie. Chocolate and sugar and butter combined by a woman who chose to be kind. She takes a bite. The taste is sweet, rich, perfect. And somewhere in that simple act-eating dessert, given freely by someone who had every reason to withhold it, the propaganda dies a little more. The walls crack a little further. The possibility of trust, of shared humanity, of a future that isn't defined by hatred, becomes a little more real. It's just a brownie. But it's also evidence that better is possible. That people can choose kindness even when kindness isn't required. That the distance between enemy and human being is shorter than anyone imagined. And that sometimes The most revolutionary act is simply treating someone with unexpected grace. The brownie is gone in 3 bites, but the memory will last a lifetime, will be passed to children and grandchildren, will become part of the story of how enemies became something else, how war ended and peace began, how the world was rebuilt, one small kindness at a time. It started with a brownie and a glass of chocolate milk in the Arizona desert. And it proved that even after everything, after war and destruction and propaganda and death, humanity persists. Kindness survives. Hope endures. One brownie at a time.